Here is part 1 of the story, adjusted to be approximately 2,000 words. I have tightened the pacing slightly while maintaining the cinematic detail and emotional depth you requested. Video title: The Highway to Healing, A Bobcat Story Part 1, The Winter Silence. Visual: the video opens with the high-resolution photo you provided. It zooms in slowly on Earl's face, his aviator sunglasses reflecting the open road, his smile wide and genuine. The camera pans to the bobcats, mouths open in a chaotic symphony of meows and yawns. The energy is electric, loud, and joyful. Then, the screen cuts to black. Silence falls. The image fades in slowly to a desaturated, blue-gray animation of a solitary cabin in the middle of a vast, snowy wilderness. Narrator: if you look at that photograph without knowing the context, you might think you are looking at a man who has always been the life of the party. You see the aviator sunglasses, the bright yellow t-shirt, and the chaotic joy of two wild predators screaming along to the radio. You see a man named Earl Whitaker living his best life. But a photograph is just a millisecond of time frozen forever. It doesn't show you the years that came before the shutter clicked. It doesn't show you the silence. To understand the miracle of that smile, you have to understand the darkness that nearly swallowed him whole. You have to go back to a time before the engine hummed, before the laughter returned, to a night when the only sound in Earl's world was the wind trying to tear his house apart. This story didn't begin with a road trip. It began with an ending. It began on the night winter showed its cruelest face. The light had turned amber across Big Timber, spreading like thick honey over the weathered planks of the cabin that stood at the edge of the forest. But inside the cabin, the light held no warmth. For Earl, the sun had set a long time ago. He was 74 years old, and he had spent the better part of a decade wrapped in a loneliness that felt heavier than the timber walls around him. The cabin was sturdy, but it felt hollow. It was a place where silence lived, not the peaceful silence of rest, but the heavy, suffocating silence of waiting. Earl had settled into a routine that was less about living and more about existing. He would wake up before dawn, not because he had somewhere to be, but because sleep was a mercy that rarely lasted long enough. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable and gray. He had convinced himself of a grim, absolute truth. His story was already written, and he was simply lingering on the final blank page. He believed that he would fade away in this cabin, that he would eventually die here alone, and that nobody would notice for weeks. He imagined the snow burying the driveway, the mail piling up, and his existence simply flickering out like a candle in a draft. He was a man who had built a shell around his heart, impenetrable and cold. On this particular evening, the physical world seemed determined to match the emptiness inside him. A massive blizzard had descended upon the valley. It wasn't just snow, it was a white hurricane. The snow fell thick enough to blur the line between the earth and the sky, erasing the horizon and turning the world into a swirling void of white violence. The wind howled against the timber walls, a relentless, screaming force that shook the window panes. It sounded like the earth itself was in pain. Earl sat in his armchair for a long time that night, watching the fire die down. He didn't bother to add another log. What was the point? The cold was going to get in eventually. It always did. He stood up, his knees popping with age, and walked to his bedroom. He climbed into his narrow bed, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to his chin. The air in the unheated bedroom was frigid. His breath formed small clouds in the darkness. He closed his eyes, listening to the gale battering the roof, and drifted into that gray, murky space between sleep and wakefulness. But the night had other plans. It started as a fracture in the dark. A sound that didn't belong. It pierced through the layers of his sleep, sharp and dissonant. Earl shifted beneath the quilt. He told himself it was the wind. The wind played tricks in these canyons. But the sound came again. It was faint at first, barely a whisper against the roaring backdrop of the storm. But it was insistent. A fragile, broken cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Earl's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still in the pitch black, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He strained his ears, filtering out the bass rumble of the wind, hunting for that treble note of distress. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't the house settling. It was something alive. Something suffering. A logical man would have stayed in bed. A logical man of 74 would have known that stepping out into a blizzard was a dangerous, foolish idea. He would have told himself that this is nature's way, cruel and efficient. But Earl felt a pull he hadn't felt in a decade. That cry, it sounded lonely. It sounded exactly the way Earl felt every single day. He didn't hesitate. Earl threw the quilt aside. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, slapping his skin, but he ignored it. He moved with a speed that belied his age. He grabbed the wool blanket from the foot of his bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress and jammed his feet into his heavy winter boots. He didn't bother to lace them. There was no time. The urgency of the cry was driving him now. He stood up, stomping his feet to settle them into the loose boots, and rushed into the main room. He snatched the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter. The metal was ice-cold in his hand. He marched to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. When he pushed the latch, the door didn't move. The wind was pressing against it from the outside, and the snow had already drifted high against the threshold. Earl gritted his teeth. He planted his feet, leaned his shoulder into the wood, and shoved. With a crack of breaking ice, the door gave way. Instantly, the storm assaulted him. The wind didn't just blow, it punched. Snow blew into the cabin entrance, swirling around his legs. The cold bit at his face immediately, numbing his cheeks and making his eyes water. It was a hostile, alien environment. But in the sudden opening, the sound was louder. It called to him again, clearer now, piercing the roar of the wind. It was coming from the tree line that bordered his property. Earl clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the falling snow in a pale yellow cone, illuminating a world that had been turned into a chaotic blur of white. He stepped out onto the porch and plunged into the snow. It was knee-deep. His unlaced boots sank deep with each step, snow packing into the tops and melting against his ankles. He stumbled, catching his balance, clutching the wool blanket tight around his shoulders like a cape. "Where are you?" he shouted into the wind, his voice snatched away instantly. He pushed forward. It was a trudge, a battle against the elements. But he followed the cries like a man being pulled by an invisible thread. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he had to find it. The cries grew louder, more desperate. He reached the edge of the forest. The pine trees were bowed heavy under the weight of the snow. Earl swept the light back and forth, scanning the ground. And then, the flashlight beam swept across something that made him stop dead. Hanging from a low pine branch, swaying slightly in the violent wind, was an old jacket. It was soaked through, frozen stiff, heavy with ice. And beneath it, partially buried in a snowdrift, lay the still form of an animal. Earl moved closer, the dread rising in his throat. He aimed the light directly at the form. It was an adult bobcat. She was beautiful, even in death. Her spotted coat was dusted with snow. Earl knelt beside her, ignoring the snow soaking into his pants. He reached out to touch her flank. She was rock-hard, stiff with cold. She had been gone for hours. Earl's heart clenched. The tragedy of it struck him with blunt force. This was the brutality of the wild, a mother who had fought to stay warm until the very end. But the cries hadn't stopped. In fact, they were right here. Earl swung the flashlight lower, searching the snow around the mother's body. And there they were. 2 tiny faces. 2 bobcat cubs, impossibly small. Their fur was still fluffy with youth. Their eyes were enormous, reflecting the flashlight beam with a mixture of blinding terror and desperate hope. They were huddled together, pressed tight against their mother's frozen body, shaking violently from cold and hunger. They were shaking with the overwhelming terror of being abandoned in a frozen world. Earl stared at them. Time seemed to suspend itself. The roar of the wind faded into the background, and his world narrowed down to the cone of yellow light and those 4 terrified eyes. He was at a crossroads. He knew nothing about bobcats. He knew that taking them was likely illegal, illogical, and dangerous. He knew that if he picked them up, he was crossing a line from which there was no return. But looking at them, shivering in the snow, Earl didn't see wild animals. He saw 2 fellow survivors. He saw 2 souls who had been cast adrift, just like him. He didn't stop to think about the logistics. He didn't think about whether he had the right food or if this was wise. He simply moved. Earl unwrapped the warm wool blanket from his own shoulders. The wind instantly seized the opportunity, slicing through his flannel shirt and chilling him to the bone. He didn't care. He knelt deeper in the snow. He reached out with his large, rough hands. The cubs mewed pitifully. They were too weak to hiss, too frozen to scratch. They didn't fight him. They were past the point of fear. They were in the realm of desperate surrender. Earl scooped them up. They weighed nothing, just handfuls of fluff and shivering bone. He bundled them carefully into the blanket, creating a makeshift pouch against his chest. He pulled the ends tight, cocooning them against his body. He looked down at the bundle, feeling their tiny hearts beating frantically against his own ribs. "Come on now," he whispered, his voice hoarse and breaking. "Let's go home. Let's get you warm." It was a fleeting decision, made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But as Earl stood up and turned his back on the forest, he was carrying more than just two animals. He was carrying his salvation. The walk back to the cabin was a blur. Earl trudged through the drifts, head down, plowing through the wind. He protected the bundle with his arms, hunching over them. Every step was a battle, but for the first time in years, he had a destination. He wasn't just going back to a building, he was bringing life into it. He reached the porch, stomped the snow from his boots, and wrestled the door open again. He tumbled inside and kicked the door shut behind him, slamming it against the howling wind. The silence of the cabin hit him, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty. He walked straight to the fireplace. His hands shook uncontrollably, partly from the severe cold, but partly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knelt on the hearthrug. He grabbed the iron poker and stirred the dying embers. He threw on kindling, blowing on the sparks until they caught. He added larger logs, stacking them high, until the fire roared back to life, the flames leaping up the chimney, throwing a chaotic, dancing orange light across the walls. Only then did Earl settle back. He sat on the floor, not in his chair. He sat right in front of the warmth. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped the blanket. Two pairs of eyes blinked up at him. The firelight reflected in their pupils. They were no longer shaking quite so violently. The warmth of the fire and the man's chest had begun to thaw their frozen bodies. Earl looked at the wall behind him. The fire cast a shadow, large, hunched, and solitary. But now, intersecting with his shadow, were two smaller, fuzzy shapes. They all existed in that flickering world together. Three souls connected by nothing more than warmth and chance. Earl stared at them, and they stared at him. The barriers between species seemed to dissolve in the heat of the fire. They weren't predator and prey. They were just three living things huddling against the dark. A sound escaped Earl's throat. It bubbled up from somewhere deep, rusty, and unused. It was a sound between a laugh and a sob. He reached out with a single finger, his skin rough and weathered, and gently stroked the top of one small, spotted head. The fur was incredibly soft. The cub leaned into the touch. "Looks like I've got teammates now," Earl muttered to the empty cabin. The words hung in the air, absurd and true all at once. He was 74 years old. An hour ago, he had been a man waiting for the end of his life. He had been a ghost haunting his own house. But looking at the two tiny bandits now curled up in his blanket, Earl realized that the waiting was over. The silence had been broken. And as the storm raged impotently outside, Earl Whitaker sat on his floor and realized he had absolutely no idea what he was doing, but for the first time in a decade, weeks were not the Disney movie that people imagine. They were a trial by fire. Earl had assumed, in his naive compassion, that caring for bobcat kittens would be straightforward. Feed them, keep them warm, and eventually release them. It was a clean, sensible plan. But Thistle and Solace, names that came to him as he watched their personalities unfurl like leaves in spring, had different ideas entirely. They didn't want to be guests. They wanted to be conquerors. Earl discovered this the hard way when he returned from a quick supply run to town. He walked through the door, expecting peace, and instead found a crime scene. Every single pair of wool socks he owned, thick, gray, sensible socks, had been dragged out of his dresser drawers. They had been shredded, pulled apart thread by thread, and piled into a massive, fuzzy mountain beneath the sofa. Sitting atop this mound of conquered wool was the male cub, Thistle. He looked at Earl with a gaze of absolute triumph, his chest puffed out, looking for all the world like a king surveying his kingdom. He wasn't sorry. He was proud. Then there was Solace. If Thistle was the brute force, Solace was the tactical genius. She developed an obsession with the television remote control. She would wait, feigning sleep, until Earl set the device down on the side table. The moment his hand pulled away, she would strike. With lightning speed, she would snatch the remote in her jaws and take off running, leaping over ottomans and sliding under chairs. Earl, a man who moved with the slow caution of arthritis, found himself chasing a streak of spotted fur through the living room, shouting commands that sounded ridiculous even to his own ears. He would corner her, trying to look stern, but then he would catch a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror, red-faced, out of breath, and holding a half-eaten cat toy, and the laughter would bubble up before he could stop it. It was a rusty sound, foreign to the cabin walls, but it was getting louder every day. But there were quieter battles to be fought, too. The practical reality of keeping them weighed on him. One morning, Earl picked up the telephone with trembling fingers. He dialed the number for the Big Timber Wildlife Rescue and waited. When Carol Jennings answered, her voice professional and kind, Earl explained the situation. He told her about the storm, the frozen mother, and the 2 orphans now currently wrestling on his hearthrug. There was a long pause on the line. Then Carol asked the question that Earl had been dreading. "Mr. Whitaker," she said gently, "are you absolutely sure you can take care of them? Bobcat cubs require constant attention. It's a significant commitment." Earl looked across the room. Thistle had paused his wrestling match and was looking at Earl, his head tilted. Solace was asleep, her small body rising and falling in a rhythm that Earl had memorized. He thought about the empty calendar on his wall. He thought about the silence that used to press against his eardrums. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "I used to think I'd die in this cabin and nobody would notice for weeks. I'd become just another old man who faded away." He took a breath. "But now I've got to schedule when to clean up shredded socks. I've got reasons to wake up again." He heard Carol laugh softly on the other end. It was the sound of permission. When he hung up the phone, Earl caught his reflection in the window again. A thin smile had appeared on his weathered face, the first genuine smile he had worn in years. As the winter thawed into spring, the cabin ceased to be Earl's retreat and became their shared den. The boundaries of personal space evaporated. Earl's leather reading chair, where he had once sat alone with his grief, was now claimed by Solace. She would curl up in the seat like a queen on a throne, her tail wrapped neatly around her body, forcing Earl to sit on the ottoman. His bed, which had felt too large and too cold since his wife Margaret passed, now accommodated 3 bodies every night. Solace would circle twice before collapsing in the center, resting her head on the spare pillow, while Thistle preferred to tuck himself against Earl's legs, his deep, rumbling purr vibrating through the mattress and into Earl's bones. It was in these quiet moments that the real healing began. It wasn't just that the bobcats needed him. Earl realized, with a start, that he needed them just as desperately. One particularly cold morning, Earl set down 2 bowls of food in the kitchen. He needed to go outside to split firewood, so he pulled on his jacket and headed out, assuming the cats would eat as they always did. When he returned 20 minutes later, stamping the slush from his boots, he froze. The bowls were full. Thistle was sitting beside his food, untouched, staring at the door with an expression of intense, patient waiting. Earl frowned. He checked the food. It was fresh. He looked at Thistle. "What are you waiting for, buddy?" Only when Earl walked over and sat down on the floor, getting down to Thistle's level, did the bobcat lower his head and begin to eat. The realization washed over Earl like a physical wave. Thistle wasn't hungry for food. He was hungry for company. He didn't want to eat alone. He wanted his pack. He wanted his dad. Earl sat there, his back against the cabinet, watching the animal eat, tears prickling his eyes. "You're not hungry in your belly," he whispered to the kitchen. "You're hungry in your heart." That hunger for connection broke the last of the dams inside Earl. The apathy that had ruled his life began to crumble. One afternoon, he found Thistle batting an old yellow pencil across the floorboards. Earl picked it up, noticing the small teeth marks in the wood. He carried it to the desk in the corner, a desk that had been gathering dust for 3 years. He opened a drawer and pulled out a journal that hadn't seen ink since the funeral. He sat down and wrote. He wrote about bobcats and snowstorms and the terrifying, wonderful realization that he was still alive. A few days later, emboldened by this return to the living, Earl rummaged through the high cupboards until he found it, Margaret's old pumpkin pie mold. It was dusty, neglected. He washed it in the sink, the soapy water feeling like a baptism of sorts. He mixed the ingredients from memory, his hands moving with a rhythm he thought he had lost. Solace sat on the counter, watching him with an intensity that suggested baking was a sacred ritual. When the pie came out, golden and fragrant, Earl didn't eat it alone standing over the sink. He cut 3 pieces. 1 for himself. And 2 smaller portions, cooled and crumbled, for his family. They ate together in the kitchen, the smell of spices filling the air, reclaiming the house from the ghosts of the past. But the cabin could only hold so much energy. As the cubs grew, their world needed to expand. They were wild creatures, after all, and the 4 walls were becoming too small for their spirits. This led to the ritual that would make them legends. It started with the old pickup truck. The hinges groaned when Earl tugged the door open, a sound that usually signaled a lonely trip to the hardware store. But this time, he wasn't going alone. He didn't have to coerce them. Thistle, with his usual dignified gait, padded across the gravel and hopped into the passenger seat as if he had been doing it for decades. He settled upright, his tufted ears swiveling forward, watching the road through the windshield like a seasoned co-pilot. Solace was even quicker. She leaped into the back, her movements fluid and graceful, positioning herself by the window before Earl could even turn the key. Earl turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then settled into a steady rumble. He eased the truck forward, the tires crunching on the dirt road. He expected panic. He expected them to scramble or hiss. Instead, something extraordinary happened. As the truck picked up speed and the forest air rushed through the open windows, the bobcats closed their eyes. They leaned into the wind. They didn't look like animals in captivity. They looked like travelers savoring the journey. The scent of pine resin, wild grasses, and mountain streams flooded the cab. To anyone watching, it was clear they were tasting freedom, but a specific kind of freedom. A freedom chosen, not forced. A freedom shared. They began to drive every evening. It became their vespers, their evening prayer. The golden hour, across Big Timber, became Earl's favorite time of day. He would drive slowly, rarely pushing the needle past 20, letting the world roll by. And the world began to notice. The first time they passed a neighbor, old Marvin, he was standing by his fence. He dropped his rake. He stared, mouth agape, at the yellow truck with the old man and the 2 wildcats. Earl didn't hide. He didn't look away. He waved. And Marvin, stunned, waved back. Soon, the truck became a fixture. The strangest parade the town had ever seen. Children playing in driveways would stop their games when they heard the rumble of Earl's engine. They would point and shout, "Hello, Bobcat Grandpa!" The nickname stuck. Earl didn't mind. In fact, he loved it. It was a new identity. He wasn't poor Earl, the widower, anymore. He was the Bobcat Grandpa. He was the man with the magic truck. One evening, after returning from a drive where the sky had turned a bruising violet over the mountains, Earl sat on his porch. The truck engine ticked as it cooled. Solace was draped over his shoulders like a fur stole, purring into his ear. Thistle was busy investigating the treat pouch in Earl's pocket. Marvin came by again. He leaned on the fence, shaking his head with a grin. "Well, I'll be damned," Marvin said. "I haven't seen you smile like that since Margaret's funeral. Not once in all these years." Earl paused. He raised a hand to his face, touching the corners of his mouth. The skin felt different. The muscles were engaged. He realized Marvin was right. He wasn't just baring his teeth. He was smiling. A real, genuine smile that came from deep inside. The wrinkles around his eyes had softened. The hunch in his shoulders was gone. He looked down at the bobcats. They gazed up at him with absolute, unshakable trust. They didn't know he was old. They didn't know he was grieving. They just knew he was theirs. Earl felt a knot in his chest, a knot that had been pulled tight for 5 years, finally begin to loosen. He looked at Marvin and nodded. "I guess I found some good company." The transformation was complete. The ghost was gone. The man had returned. But as the seasons turned and the bobcats grew from clumsy kittens into powerful, elegant adults, a new question began to form in the back of Earl's mind. A question that nagged at him during the quiet hours of the night. He was 74. They were wild animals. He had written a will years ago, leaving his empty life to a distant cousin. But now, his life wasn't empty. It was full. And that fullness brought a new kind of fear. One night, Earl opened his desk drawer and pulled out his last will and testament. He stared at the legal jargon. It felt cold. Dead. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to write a new plan. A trust fund. A sanctuary designation. He wrote furiously, trying to secure their future. But then he stopped. He looked at the two bobcats sleeping on his bed, Solace stretched out, Thistle twitching in a dream. Earl tore the paper in half. His hands were shaking, not from age, but from a fierce, stubborn defiance. "Not yet," he whispered to the room. "I'm not going anywhere yet." The paperwork could wait. The lawyers could wait. Earl Whitaker had a lot of driving left to do. Here is part 3, the final chapter of the story. I have brought the narrative full circle, connecting the emotional journey back to the joyful energy of the photo you provided, while incorporating the specific heartwarming details from the transcript regarding the community and the open house. Video title: The Highway to Healing, A Bobcat Story Part 3, The Road Home. Visual: the video transitions from the quiet interior of the cabin to a bright, sun-drenched Sunday morning. We see the exterior of the cabin, but instead of snow, there is green grass. Cars are parked along the dirt road. We see children running towards the porch. The atmosphere is vibrant and alive. Narrator: if the winter was about survival and the spring was about awakening, then the summer brought something Earl Whitaker never saw coming: belonging. The Bobcat Grandpa nickname hadn't just stuck, it had become a beacon. The people of Big Timber, who had once respected Earl's grief by giving him a wide berth, now found themselves drawn to the strange magic happening at the edge of the woods. The story of the old man and his wild companions had rippled through the valley, turning skepticism into wonder. It was Marvin, the neighbor who had first witnessed the truck parade, who planted the seed for the next step. He leaned over the fence one afternoon, watching Thistle chase a butterfly through the tall grass, and cleared his throat. "Earl," he said, "I've been thinking. You know how the kids in town go crazy when they see you driving past? What if you opened up your place one Sunday? Just for a few hours. Let folks come by. Let the children meet Thistle and Solace properly." Earl's instinct was to recoil. His cabin was his sanctuary. It was the private fortress where he had hidden from the world. The idea of filling it with strangers, with noise, with judgment, made his stomach knot. "I don't know, Marv," he muttered. "They're wild animals. And I'm not much for hosting these days." Marvin looked him in the eye. "I think it would mean a lot to the people, Earl. But mostly, I think it might mean something to you." Reluctantly, Earl agreed. He told himself he would do it once. Just one Sunday. If it was a disaster, he would lock the gate and never do it again. That Sunday, the gravel driveway, which had sat empty for years, filled with cars. Earl stood on his porch, his hands sweating, watching families approach. He felt a familiar urge to retreat, to hide in the bedroom. But then he felt a heavy weight lean against his leg. It was Thistle. The bobcat looked up at him, blinking slowly, radiating a calm confidence that Earl didn't feel. "We've got this, Dad," the look seemed to say. The afternoon that followed was nothing short of miraculous. The cabin, once a tomb of silence, overflowed with life. Children sat cross-legged on the rug, the same rug where Earl had nursed the freezing cubs, giggling as Thistle sniffed their sneakers. Solace moved through the crowd with the grace of a diplomat, accepting gentle strokes on her back, her eyes bright and intelligent. She didn't hide. She seemed to understand that these small humans were curious, not dangerous. There was one moment that Earl would carry with him forever. An elderly woman from town, Mrs. Higgins, had come in wearing a heavy gray scarf that looked like wolf fur. She sat in Earl's rocking chair, the one he rarely used because it reminded him too much of the evenings he used to spend there with Margaret. Earl watched nervously as Thistle approached her. The bobcat paused, sniffed the air, and then, to everyone's shock, climbed directly into Mrs. Higgins' lap. The room went silent. Earl took a step forward, ready to intervene. But Thistle didn't hiss. He settled himself down, kneading the wool of her skirt, and began to purr. It was a sound like a small engine, loud enough to fill the room. Mrs. Higgins' eyes filled with tears as she ran her hand over his spotted coat. "He knows," she whispered to Earl. "He knows I needed this." Earl stood by the fireplace, a mug of cooling tea in his hands, and realized that the walls of his isolation had completely dissolved. He wasn't the lonely widower on the hill anymore. He was the caretaker of a miracle. As the summer deepened, Earl felt a new urge. He went to the hall closet, pushing aside heavy winter coats until he found a black leather case on the top shelf. He blew the dust off it. It was Margaret's old camera. She had been the photographer of the family, the one who documented every birthday and holiday. After she died, Earl couldn't bear to look at it. It was just another mechanical eye that had closed. But now, standing in a shaft of soft afternoon sunlight, he felt ready. He lifted the camera to his eye. The weight of it felt familiar. He adjusted the focus ring, the mechanism clicking softly. Through the lens, he saw Thistle licking delicately at the rim of a teacup someone had left on the coffee table. Click. He turned. He saw Solace lying on the front porch steps, her body stretched out long, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line, looking like a sphinx guarding a temple. Click. He took the film to the small lab in town. When he got the prints back a week later, Earl spread them across his kitchen table. He stared at them for a long time. They weren't just pictures of animals. They captured something true and real. They captured love. He found a pen and flipped over his favorite image, the one of both bobcats curled together in a puddle of sunlight, their paws entangled. On the back, he wrote 3 words, "My wild family." He placed it in a frame and set it on the kitchen table, right next to the salt and pepper shakers, where he would see it every single morning. It was a declaration. This wasn't a temporary phase. This was his second life. And that brings us to the photo. The one that started this whole story. It was taken on a Tuesday. No special occasion. Just a Tuesday that was too beautiful to waste indoors. Earl put on his favorite yellow t-shirt, a color he never used to wear because he thought it was too loud for an old man. He grabbed his aviator sunglasses. He jingled the keys. The reaction was instantaneous. Thistle and Solace, who had been napping, sprang to life. They trotted to the truck with tails high. Earl climbed in. He cranked the window down. He turned the radio up, classic rock, something with a beat. As they hit the highway, the wind rushed in. The photo captures the exact moment the chorus hit. Look at Earl's face. That is not the face of a man waiting to die. That is the face of a man who has won a victory over despair. He is singing. He is shouting at the wind. And look at his co-pilots. Roxy, Solace, has claimed the shoulder perch, acting like the navigator, her mouth open in a wild yawn that looks like a laugh. Riff, Thistle, is hanging out the window, his face contorted in pure chaotic joy, screaming his own wild song into the slipstream. They aren't pets. They are teammates. They are fellow travelers on the highway to healing. As the truck rolled down the red dirt road that evening, heading back toward the cabin, the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. The adrenaline of the drive faded into a peaceful hum. Earl slowed the truck down. He looked at the empty seat beside him, then at the rearview mirror where Solace was watching the dust swirl behind them. He spoke aloud, his voice barely audible over the engine. "I used to think my life would end in silence," he said. "I was certain of it. But you too. You changed the station." He pulled into the driveway. The cabin waited for them, warm and inviting. It wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was home. Earl turned off the ignition. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the winter. It was the peaceful silence of contentment. He turned to look at Thistle, whose ear twitched in response. He looked at Solace, whose eyes shimmered with the absolute security of knowing she belonged. Earl felt his heart swell, full nearly to breaking. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for teaching me how to look at the sun again. Thank you for teaching me how to live." Earl Whitaker got out of the truck. He didn't walk with the shuffle of an old man. He walked with purpose. The two bobcats jumped down and flanked him, one on each side, as they walked up the porch steps together. Three souls, moving together through the fading light, heading into a home where warmth, safety, and love had put down roots so deep that no storm could ever tear them loose again. The winter was over. The road was open. And for the Bobcat Grandpa, the ride was just beginning.